I'm Claire Monroe, 29 years old. Just 5 days ago, one family dinner turned my whole life inside out. I'd spent years swallowing silence, watching my parents bend the world around my sister's wants. But that night, something in me broke quietly, completely. They thought they were putting me in my place. Instead, they just handed me the key to change everything. The grandfather clock in our dining room struck 7:30 that Friday evening, its brass pendulum catching the last rays of October sunlight. That hollow metallic chime seemed to echo longer than usual, as if the house itself knew what was coming. My mother sat across from me, her smile stretched so wide it looked painful, smoothing the tablecloth with her manicured nails. A nervous habit she'd developed whenever she was about to deliver bad news wrapped in sugar coating. Dad sat at the head of the table, his jaw set in that particular way that meant he'd already made up his mind. The smell of pot roast filled the air, my mother's signature dish, the one she only made when she needed to soften a blow. Sophia, my 26-year-old sister, hadn't touched her food. She just sat there, twirling her blonde hair, that little smirk playing at the corners of her mouth, like she was savoring a secret joke. The overhead light cast shadows under her eyes, making her look almost predatory. The tension in the room was so thick you could practically taste it, metallic and bitter, like old pennies on your tongue. My mother cleared her throat with that delicate little sound she made when she was about to say something monumentally unfair, but wanted it to sound reasonable. She announced in her syrupy voice that Sophia needed more space for her new art studio, that the two rooms needed to be connected for proper ventilation and lighting. The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. Sophia's smirk widened into a full grin as she emphasized how she needed the space to create real art, like everything I'd ever done was worthless. Before I could protest, my father's fist came down on the table so hard the water glasses jumped. "Agree or get out of this house!" His voice wasn't just loud, it was final, absolute, like a judge's gavel coming down on a life sentence. My mother's smile never wavered. Sophia actually laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking glass. Something shifted inside me, deep in my chest, but instead of exploding, I went perfectly still. I nodded once, pushed my chair back from the table, and stood up. Not one single word. They thought my silence meant surrender. I walked to my room and quietly closed the door behind me. My hands weren't shaking as I opened my laptop and scrolled through emails. There was one with my grandmother Eleanor's initials, EM, in the subject line marked for Wednesday. I stared at it for a moment, then made a brief phone call. The voice on the other end was professional, confirming only that the Wednesday meeting was set. Through my window, I could see the old Victorian across the street, its windows dark. The house had been empty since I could remember, paint-peeling porch sagging slightly. Strange how I'd never really noticed the way its tower window aligned perfectly with my bedroom. I whispered to my reflection that in 5 days everything would change, though I wasn't entirely sure what that meant yet. Saturday morning arrived with gray clouds hanging low enough to touch, and the smell of rain mixed with something else, that metallic scent that comes before a storm really breaks. I woke at dawn, my body already tense with purpose, and immediately started packing. Each piece of clothing went into the boxes with careful folds, corners aligned perfectly, the way I'd learned to make myself neat and small and convenient over the years. The house was quiet, except for the sound of packing tape being pulled from its roll, that harsh ripping sound that seemed too loud in the morning stillness, echoing off the walls like an accusation. Downstairs by the front door, on my father's coat rack, I noticed his old keyring hanging from his jacket pocket, heavy with more keys than anyone could reasonably need. They clinked softly when the morning breeze from the cracked window caught them, each one tagged with faded labels written in his cramped handwriting that I couldn't quite make out from where I stood. Some looked newer than others, silver and sharp-edged, while others had that dull brass patina that comes from years of handling. The memories flooded back as I wrapped my few belongings in yesterday's newspaper, the ink already smudging on my fingers, leaving gray marks like ash. My 18th birthday came back in vivid detail, the dollar store card with a generic sunset on the front, while downstairs the caterers were setting up for Sophia's delayed quinceañera party that just happened to fall on the same day. $15,000 spent on ice sculptures and a live band while I sat in my room eating a slice of grocery store cake with frosting that tasted like sweetened petroleum. Then there was the letter from Colombia I'd found torn into precise squares in the kitchen trash, mixed with coffee grounds and eggshells, my mother's way of making sure I couldn't tape it back together to frame it like I'd planned. But the strongest memories were of my grandmother Eleanor, the only person in this house who'd ever looked at me and actually seen me instead of seeing through me. She'd lived somewhere nearby, close enough that I could visit, but far enough that my parents could pretend she didn't exist most of the time. After she passed 2 years ago, the family never spoke of where exactly she'd lived, as if her address had died with her. I still had the teacup she'd given me for my 16th birthday, painted with tiny pink roses so delicate they looked like they might blow away. And when I held it close, I could almost smell the lavender tea she used to make, that specific blend she ordered from a shop in the city that came in purple tins with her initials embossed on top. My mother appeared in my doorway like a ghost in expensive silk, her pajamas the color of champagne, and just as useless for real comfort. She stood there watching me pack with an expression that tried to be concerned, but came off as merely inconvenienced, like I was an appliance that had broken at an inopportune time. Her voice had that quality of forced patience when she told me I was being dramatic about the whole situation. That the basement guest room was perfectly adequate with its one small window and the water heater that groaned all night, like something dying. When she mentioned my grandmother, her voice took on that bitter edge it always did, sharp enough to cut glass. She said Eleanor had been dead 2 years now, and it was time I stopped living in fantasy, stopped pretending the old woman's opinions mattered anymore. The mention of Grandma made something flicker in my chest, hot and bright like a pilot light suddenly catching. My mother had married into the Monroe family 29 years ago, thinking she'd hit the jackpot. But she had seen through her from day one, seen through the performative sweetness and calculated charm. Every time I'd visit my grandmother for our Sunday teas, every time she'd praised my patience or my intelligence or just the way I held my teacup properly, my mother's jaw would tighten until you could see the muscle jumping under her skin, and her eyes would go cold as winter stones. The jealousy had poisoned everything in our house, seeping into conversations and holidays, and even casual breakfasts, though I'd never understood its true depth until much later. Sophia appeared next to Mom like they were a matched set, already dressed in one of her paint-splattered designer outfits that cost more than most people's rent. The paint stains were artful, deliberate, placed just so to suggest creativity without actual mess. She stood with one hip cocked, her phone in her hand, even though it was barely 7 in the morning, and announced she'd been planning this expansion for 6 months, that she needed both rooms for proper studio space, with the right light and ventilation for her pieces. The casual cruelty of how she dismissed my entire existence 29 years, reduced to an inconvenience in her artistic vision, should have hurt. But I was past hurt, past anger, past everything, except the cold, clear purpose that had crystallized in my chest like ice. I made another phone call, turning slightly away from them both, speaking quietly to someone at what I only referred to as the office. My voice stayed level and professional as I confirmed that Wednesday still worked for the meeting, that all the paperwork was in order. My father walked past just then, his heavy footsteps pausing when he heard me talking. His eyes narrowed with that suspicious look he got when he thought someone was keeping something from him, and he filled the doorway with his presence the way he always did, using his size to make you feel small. He demanded to know who I was talking to, and what meeting I meant, his voice carrying that edge of authority he used at his company. I simply said it was about housing arrangements, and watched his interest fade, immediately dismissing me as thoroughly as if I'd become invisible again. Sunday came, wrapped in fog so thick you couldn't see across the street, the Victorian house completely erased like it had never existed. I spent the morning in the living room, where they'd moved my things during the night, my boxes and garbage bags piled in the corner like I was already trash waiting for Monday's pickup. The couch was lumpy with broken springs that dug into your spine no matter how you positioned yourself, and the room smelled like my father's cigars mixed with that particular staleness that comes from years of pretending everything was fine. I sat there with my old journal, the leather-bound one Eleanor had given me for my 16th birthday, reading entries about birthdays forgotten and achievements ignored. The pages were soft from age, some watermarked with tears I didn't remember crying. One entry from 3 months ago stood out, my handwriting shaky with emotion. It mentioned a phone call about Eleanor's affairs, about papers to sign, about choices that couldn't be unmade once committed to. The details were vague even to me now, written in a kind of code I'd developed to keep my secrets safe. But I remembered the feeling of that day perfectly, like standing at the edge of a cliff waiting to jump or be pushed, knowing either way I was going over. My mother found me there with the journal, her approach silent as always, that practiced stealth she'd perfected over years. She sat down across from me in the wingback chair, arranging her silk robe, just so, always performing even with no audience except me. She asked if Eleanor had left me anything, trying to sound casual, but failing the hunger in her voice sharp as broken glass. I kept my voice steady and told her there were just some personal items, nothing valuable. Her entire body relaxed with genuine relief, shoulders dropping, breath coming out in a long exhale like she'd been holding it for months. She patted my knee with condescension so thick you could cut it with a knife. She complained about spending years as the dutiful daughter-in-law with nothing to show for it. Bringing groceries, Eleanor barely acknowledged, sitting through tea ceremonies where Eleanor praised my posture while ignoring her completely. The bitterness in her voice could have curdled milk. She couldn't understand why Eleanor had always seemed to favor me when I'd done nothing special to earn it. I remembered something Eleanor had written in a letter, one I'd only partially read, afraid of what the rest might say. The part I'd seen mentioned something about positions and perspectives, about how power wasn't in the holding, but in the viewing. It hadn't made sense then, but sitting there with my mother's bitter words washing over me, I began to understand. There was another page to that letter, still sealed with red wax, with instructions not to open it until a certain condition was met. Something about living somewhere for a full year, though the where and why remained a mystery. I could feel its weight in my pocket, where I'd carried it for 3 months, warm against my hip, like a promise. Sophia appeared with her phone already recording, calling it footage of me being dramatic. She narrated her version where I was the difficult one who couldn't share, though we both knew it was really about humiliation. I watched her performance and felt nothing but cold certainty settling in my bones. She kept mentioning her struggles with the art school, how they were demanding something from her, though she was careful not to say what. Her confidence was cracking around the edges, fear seeping through, and how her voice went higher at the end of sentences, how she kept checking her phone even while recording. She was scared of something, and for the first time I realized I wasn't the only one in this family standing at the edge of a cliff. Monday morning arrived with bright sunshine that felt like mockery, too cheerful for the war brewing in our house. 7 o'clock sharp, the family gathered for breakfast, a Monroe tradition my mother insisted on because she'd read somewhere that successful families eat together. The dining room table was set with the good china we only used when pretending to be better than we were, steam rising from scrambled eggs nobody wanted to eat. The coffee bitter and overbrewed, everything slightly off, like a photograph with the wrong colors. My father announced without looking up from his tablet that I had 2 more days to clear out completely, that Sophia's contractors were coming Thursday. His tone was casual, like discussing the weather, but when he finally looked at me over his reading glasses, those cold gray eyes held the same disappointment they'd carried for 29 years, ever since I'd been born the wrong kind of daughter. Sophia had already started moving her art supplies in expensive boxes with French labels that probably cost more than I made in a month. Half my room was already colonized by her presence, spreading like an infection, her canvases leaning against my walls like they belonged there. My phone buzzed with a text from Lisa, my only friend from high school, who still kept in touch despite my family's best efforts to isolate me. She mentioned her mom worked at the bank and had seen something flagged on our family's account, something about arrears that had raised red flags in the system. She wondered if everything was okay, adding a worried emoji that made my chest tighten with something almost like affection. I glanced at Sophia, who was sketching in her notebook with quick, aggressive strokes, but her hand trembled slightly, the pencil shaking against the paper. She kept checking her phone every few seconds, the nervous energy radiating from her like fever heat, like something inside her was about to explode. My mother cornered me in the garden after breakfast by the roses she was proud of, but never actually tended, leaving that to the gardener who came twice a week. The morning sun caught the dew on the petals, making them look like diamonds made of ice, beautiful and cold and untouchable. She told me in a low, intense voice that patience without action was just cowardice, that I needed to understand my place in this family's carefully maintained hierarchy. She mentioned my grandmother again, how Eleanor had filled my head with dangerous ideas about waiting and watching, about positions and power, her voice dripping with old resentment. The irony was so thick I could taste it, bitter as the breakfast coffee, as she stood there in her designer gardening outfit, talking about power, while having no idea what was already in motion, what had been set in motion 3 months ago. That afternoon, Mr. Harris made his scheduled visit to the neighborhood, dressed like a property assessor with his clipboard and measuring tape, playing his role perfectly. My parents practically ran outside when they saw him, their desperation barely concealed beneath a veneer of casual interest, eager to know about the area's value, about any changes that might affect their own property worth. My father asked about the old Victorian across the street, trying to sound casual, but failing miserably, his voice tight with barely suppressed hope. Harris smiled gently, that grandfather smile that gave nothing away, and mentioned the property had already changed hands, that someone would be moving in Wednesday morning. I watched from the window as my parents' faces fell in unison, their dreams of somehow benefiting from the Victorian sale evaporating. Sophia went pale as fresh paint and whispered urgently to our mother about needing money soon, about people who wouldn't wait much longer, about consequences she couldn't face. Later, when they thought I was in the shower with the water running loud, I heard fragments of conversation drifting up through the vents about authenticity, about signatures that might not hold up, about things that couldn't be verified if anyone looked too closely. That night, at exactly 11:45, I watched my father slip out of the house like a common thief. He moved across our yard, carrying something heavy wrapped in black plastic, heading toward the Victorian with the confidence of someone who'd done this before. I heard the soft scrape of metal against metal, a click like a lock giving way, then watched him disappear through a side entrance I'd only ever noticed from the sidewalk during my evening walks. He emerged 20 minutes later, empty-handed, looking around nervously like a guilty child, before hurrying back home with quick, furtive steps. I recorded it all on my phone, though the infrared mode made everything look ghostly and unreal, like evidence of a crime that hadn't quite happened yet. Wednesday morning came like Christmas and Judgment Day together. 6 o'clock sharp my alarm went off, though I'd been awake for hours. The moving truck arrived at 7:30, its engine rumble bringing everyone to the windows. I stood in the driveway, directing the movers, wearing my one good suit, my hair pulled back severely. My father burst out in his pajamas and robe, face red with indignation. He demanded to know what was happening, insisting I couldn't afford any of this. His voice had that dangerous edge from my childhood, but fear had been burned out of me long ago. I looked at him calmly and continued directing the movers, ignoring his growing rage. The revelation began when the movers started walking, not toward their truck, but across the street. Each trip they made was another crack in my family's facade. My mother ran outside in her silk nightgown, not caring who saw, screaming that this was impossible. The neighbors were emerging, drawn by the commotion, watching my mother's perfect image shatter in real time. I pulled out a key, an old brass one that had been in an envelope with my grandmother's letter. It worked perfectly in the Victorian's lock. The alarm system beeped once, then displayed, "Welcome home, Miss Monroe," on its panel. The movers tipped their caps, addressing me as the new owner. My family stood frozen on the sidewalk as understanding dawned. My father's face went from red to white. Sophia dropped her phone, the screen cracking on concrete. Eleanor had left me more than anyone knew. Not just personal items, but an entire life they'd never suspected. As my family stood there gaping, Sophia broke completely. She fell to her knees, sobbing about debts, about paintings she'd sold that weren't what they seemed, about $200,000 she needed to pay back or face consequences. She begged for help, the same girl who'd called me worthless just days ago. I mentioned finding interesting things in the Victorian's basement the previous night, boxes someone had hidden there recently. I held up a bundle of papers, copies of invoices and deposit slips with suspicious patterns. My father went gray. I suggested perhaps these should find their way to interested parties anonymously, of course. The beautiful symmetry wasn't lost on anyone my family in their nightclothes exposed, while I stood fully dressed and completely in control. 8 o'clock that evening, the sunset painted everything gold and red. They came to my door, all three looking like refugees from their own lives. My father had aged 10 years in 12 hours. My mother's makeup was ruined. Sophia looked hollow, emptied out. They stood on my porch where someone had once sat watching the neighborhood, where weathered wood still showed traces of old paint and care. My father begged about the documents, saying they could destroy him. He claimed he'd been trying to provide for the family to keep up with expenses that had spiraled beyond control. He actually got down on his knees, this man who'd terrorized our household, who'd screamed at me to leave just 5 days ago. I gave them until sunrise to remove everything from the Victorian's basement. Every box, every hidden thing, every trace. I warned that if even one paper remained, it would find its way to the authorities. I didn't invite them in or offer comfort. My mother sobbed with the kind of crying that comes from recognizing your own responsibility in your downfall. The night was surreal as I watched from the tower room that commanded views in every direction. They worked through darkness, my father calling in favors for trucks and help. Sophia struggled with boxes too heavy for her artist's hands. They fought with each other, blame flying like sparks from a fire. My mother broke a nail and cried about it as if it were the final insult. Around 3 in the morning, my mother looked up and saw me watching. Our eyes met across the distance, and I saw recognition dawn. Not of me as her daughter, but of what I'd become. She finally understood that some people are simply stronger, that her years of jealousy had been about recognizing this truth. By 5:30, as the sky began to lighten, they were finished. They sat on my steps, destroyed and exhausted. I came down dressed in clothes Eleanor had once chosen for me, checking every room to ensure they'd completed their task. The house was clean of their secrets. They waited for something, forgiveness perhaps, but found only the cold morning air. 2 weeks passed before Sophia knocked at my service entrance, not the grand front door, but the side entrance where deliveries came. She looked smaller, wearing regular clothes instead of her artistic costumes. She needed work, she said. Our parents were struggling financially. Dad's company had put him on administrative leave, pending an internal review, not fired but not trusted either. Mom had taken a position at an upscale boutique downtown, using her eye for fashion in a way that actually suited her. The words came out flat from Sophia, humbled but not entirely defeated. I'd opened a small gallery in the Victorian's East Wing, displaying art that had been in storage. I needed someone who understood art to help catalog and arrange the collection. When I offered her the position as assistant curator, starting wage, but with room to grow, something flickered in her eyes, not quite hope, but not despair either. She would learn the business side of art, the part she'd always ignored in favor of creating. My sister nodded, understanding this was both consequence and opportunity. A month later, the transformation was subtle but real. My father's company had quietly reassigned him to a smaller division, a demotion but not destruction. He still wore suits to work, just less expensive ones. Mom had discovered she was actually good at retail, her natural eye for aesthetics, finally finding practical application. They still lived across the street, but the dynamic had shifted completely. The house that had once felt too small for their ambitions now seemed to fit them better. Every morning I followed the same routine. Wake at 6, make coffee in the French press from the Victorian's kitchen, carry it to the front porch. I'd settle into the old rocking chair that still carried the faint scent of lavender and wait. 7 o'clock sharp, my family would emerge for their altered lives. And I would wave, bright and cheerful, calling out, "Good morning." They had started to wave back tentatively, as if testing whether the gesture might bridge the distance between us. The neighbors had noticed the change. The story spread through the community about the forgotten daughter who'd inherited what no one expected, but also about a family learning to live within truth instead of pretense. People who'd ignored me for years now brought welcomes and invitations, but they also still spoke to my parents, perhaps with more genuine warmth than before. That evening I opened the sealed page of Eleanor's letter, the one I'd been instructed to read only after claiming my position. Inside, she'd written that power isn't about crushing others, but about standing firm in your own truth, about being positioned to choose mercy or justice, as wisdom dictates. The 12 months required to keep the inheritance weren't a punishment, but a lesson in perspective, a chance to decide what kind of person I wanted to be from this height. Sophia had started bringing her lunch to eat in the gallery's garden during breaks. Sometimes we even talked not as sisters yet, but as two people learning to see each other clearly for the first time. She was studying the business proposals Eleanor had left behind, understanding finally that art could be both passion and profession. My parents had begun tending their own garden, my mother's hands finally dirty with real soil instead of metaphorical scheming. 5 days to lose my family. A year to decide if I wanted them back in a different form. And every morning my greeting had evolved from reminder to invitation, a daily choice to leave the door cracked open just enough for possibility. When a family treats you as less than when they systematically erase your worth, do you owe them forgiveness? Or is the greatest kindness sometimes letting people live with the consequences of their choices? Please share your thoughts below. And if you've ever had your own moment when the tables turned, I'd love to hear about it. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories where patience finally pays off.